Well, let me thank everybody for being here. As everybody in the room probably knows, I'm Pat Keenan, President of Siebert Realty. And this is just kind of an open forum conversation about the proposed ordinance to regulate short-term rentals in Sandbridge, or actually the entire city of Virginia. I had a couple of points I wanted to make here, and here with me is Kat Donald, our operations manager, and the other managers at Siebert Realty. So if anybody has specific questions or they want to chime in, don't be surprised if they jump up here as well. So as many of you know, rental properties and short-term rentals in Sandbridge have been almost coinciding with the entire history of the neighborhood. They've been around as long as the neighborhood has been around. And so obviously we're interested in maintaining the balance that we have between rental properties and residents and then daytime users of Sandbridge. So we're looking for a nice balance there. And naturally we don't want to disrupt the neighborhood, because I'm pretty sure everybody in the room here and many of us that work at Siebert Realty live in Sandbridge will call it home. And certainly we don't want our home to be disturbed any more than anybody else wants that. So that's not what we're proposing. So as everybody's probably aware, there's a proposal on the books right now with 3 different alternatives associated with short-term rentals. The proposal was made by the city attorney. I think that the proposal was worked up by city staff at the request of Barbara Henley, our representative on city council for the same borough. Mark Stiles, the city attorney, presented it with 3 different proposals, and there's about 14 points in the ordinance suggested. And we can go through each point, and for the most part, I probably plan to speak on those points that are specifically controversial, because the vast majority of this document we can support. And that might be very important for us to point out that the property managers in general support this with a few modifications. It does perhaps help us to get to an end result with a fair regulation, so long as the city council folks can see the building with consensus. They'll definitely bring something forward and champion it if everybody in them agrees. But when we have this controversy, we wind up getting into the politics of it, and we want to avoid that if we can. So it'd be great if we can build consensus walking into the meeting of city council. So I'm just going to walk down through the points, and again, please feel free to interrupt me and ask any questions as we go along here. The ordinance suggested defining clearly the difference between home sharing and short-term rentals. Home sharing, of course, is the concept of renting a room in your house, or even conceivably the couch. You see that on Airbnb, and a few other different online portals where you can rent a piece of the property or the entire property. I want to say, based on something Airbnb last put out, about a third of their properties are partial rental or partial property rentals as opposed to the entire property. As far as we're concerned, we don't really see the difference between home sharing and short-term rentals. Transient occupancy is transient occupancy in our estimation. So for our purposes, we would want everybody who's doing home sharing kind of activity to be similarly obligated to provide whatever information they have to provide, or collect and remit whatever taxes that they have to collect and remit. So that we basically have a level playing field for all people who are engaging in this type of activity. Again, that's our personal take on that one. There hasn't been a lot of discussion on that, simply because everybody agrees that they're basically all the same. So the next item on the proposed ordinance is a suggestion that perhaps there would be a short-term rental overlay district or districts created inside the city to allow for the activity in certain areas. And I guess we can imply then that the activity would not be allowed anywhere else. In general, we're not necessarily supporting that right now, simply because it's one of those concepts of what they permit, they can prohibit. And so once you get a short-term rental district, what other rules or requirements are they going to lay on us with regards to property conditions, standards, safety amenities, and those kinds of things? We would rather not try to treat the structures as commercial. We would like them to remain as much residential as we could conceivably do, because that's what they are. They're residences. They get sold under the residence umbrella. and they're just renting a house. So we don't want to be considered a business. We don't want to be considered a hotel. Because we're simply not. So in general, we're not encouraging the inclusion of the short-term rental districts in the ultimate ordinance. That's something we would suggest not be necessary. The next concept on the ordinance suggestion would be grandfathering certain provisions. And grandfathering of provisions is really only important if they don't, well, if they create a short-term rental district, we would be in favor of a grandfather provision that allows for every property that's currently doing it to continue doing it. If they require a conditional use permit for this type of activity, we would again suggest that it's reasonable to have a grandfather clause to allow for that. As to the conditional use permit, we do not encourage and agree with the idea that we would have to have a conditional use permit to rent your house down here. Again, the same thing. What you ask for permission for, they can also prohibit. And so I don't think the City Council really wants to field every single independent request for rent your house, because that's conditional use permits go to the City Council every time. So I don't think City Council necessarily wants that, and we don't support that particular piece without her. They do mention the concept of by right use. My understanding of that means that the activity would be allowed by right, as opposed to something that you have to get permission for. Effectively, again, my understanding would be if we were to get the activity of short-term rentals to be included as an accessory use to residential zoning, then we would have the by right use to rent your house on a short-term basis, and we wouldn't have to go get permission from the city. So in that regard, we would encourage the City Council to include this as an accessory use so that the activity can be kind of automatic and not require any additional permission.
Patrick,
Yes, sir.
could you, as you're talking, could you please tell me what page you're on this thing?
Okay, well, unfortunately, I'm not from cheat sheet, so indeed I can, if you'll bear with me for just a moment.
If that's too hard, it's okay.
No. Perfectly fine. I've read this thing a number of times. I should be able to find stuff easy. All right, so I am now on, well, interestingly, I'm glad I found this. I'm on page 17 of the document. This is the registration requirement. They are suggesting that there be a requirement to register your property, and there currently is a requirement to register your property if you want to rent it short-term basis in the city of Virginia Beach. Except if you are being managed or assisted in the process by a licensed real estate professional, then you do not have to register your property. The city can't mandate that you register. That's state law. It says the municipality cannot mandate the registration. I guess the assumption there is that the real estate professional is doing what they're supposed to be doing with regards to the collection and remittance of the sales tax and the transient occupancy tax. And that's the next issue on there, is the payment of the transient occupancy tax. On page 17, there's an interesting point underneath there where they reference the registration, but then they also reference a concept that's not really overtly put out there in this document, and that's adjudicated violations of 3 applicable state, local, or federal laws or regulations may result in revocation of the registration. Mind you, it doesn't apply to us because they can't require we register. However, it does introduce the idea that 3 strikes and you're out is potentially out there, where you could have 3 complaints levied against you that would then somehow affect your ability to continue renting. We would very strongly oppose any idea that somebody else's behavior would be your responsibility to be held accountable for. If someone is an adult, then they should be held accountable for their behavior. So we wouldn't want tenant activity to inflect upon an owner or reflect upon an owner's ability to rent. We would want that tenant to be held accountable, and whatever rules the city could create to do that, I guess that's on them to do, but we definitely don't support any idea that would hold the owner accountable for the behavior of the tenant. Reasonable behavior is reasonable behavior, and when you're unreasonable, the authorities step in, and that's how we would suggest it continue. Okay, so on page 18, they reference the parking. Parking being provided on site. We support that. There's no real reason for us not to, because as it stands now, we have an expectation that all the guests will be parking on the property itself and not wherever they can find a space. I guess in Sandbridge it does potentially affect, or it has some effect on the short-term parking that we have street side on San Fiddler Road south of the S-turn, and then on a lot of side streets. I don't know how anybody intends to enforce a rule that says a renter can't park in the public parking, that, you know, there's nobody down here marking tires or keeping track of licenses. Yes, sir.
Do I understand correctly that in the city of Virginia Beach, it's okay to park on the lawn?
You know, I'm not 100% sure of that. I don't know whether or not there's a rule that says you can't park on something other than a solid surface.
Certainly in our one house, that's where most of the people park. And I encourage them to do that. I just want to, when we say there's got to be parking,
Our thought is, so long as it's on site, on the property, and not illegally parked, meaning no tires where they shouldn't be, that would be our interpretation of it, and what we would agree is an acceptable rule, is that the parking be on site, that not necessarily be limited to any number of cars specifically. And I've brought that issue up a couple of times when they wanted to suggest that we advertise a number of spaces. Well, are we bringing Mini Coopers or are we bringing F-150s? Right? Those vehicles take dramatically different footprints, and so to limit it to an X number of cars, I think would be problematic. So we support the parking ordinance. The next one is on page 19 is the provision to post city code in a conspicuous place. So I took the liberty of printing off the 6 pages of city code that are referenced here, and the size of this poster would have to be substantial in order to accommodate all the text. We're of the mind to perhaps suggest that they pull out the pertinent points on city code and let us abridge what's going to be published so that it can just address directly the activity that is happening that perhaps we want to happen differently. In general, though, we are okay with publishing those provisions somewhere conspicuously in the property so that everybody has the benefit of seeing them. That's not that big of a burden for us. Let's see here. The ordinance, and I guess this is on the next page 20, the ordinance suggests that all trash be placed in the automated bins. Unfortunately, that doesn't mean the trash just goes away. It's those black cans that we see on the side of the street that the trucks can pick up and dump. We already encourage that, so there's no problem for us to fight that one. We're perfectly happy to go along with that. We probably have to do a little bit better at an education job to tell the tenants what to do with the trash when they can't fit it all in black cans, because we currently have the ability to go down there and retrieve that from them and dispose of it correctly so it doesn't decorate the sidewalk. So that's just an education thing on our side. So we can support that. So now we get to the fun ones. They suggest that we only allow 1 rental contract per 7-day period. Let's not misinterpret that as not allowing rentals shorter than 7 days. It absolutely will allow for a rental shorter than 7 days, but it won't allow for more than 1 of them in a 7-day period. So short stays don't get eliminated, but just based on some quick stats that we ran, we have about 10% of our reservations might be affected by this, depending on your interpretation of begin day and end day on the shoulder or the reservations on either side of that. So obviously that is potentially going to significantly impact us. As a group, the Business Association and the property managers in general have discussed and decided that we could support a ordinance that listed and allowed for 2 reservations in a 7-day period. We currently have a 3-night minimum, so obviously you can only squeeze 2 of those in a 7-day period. So that would easily accommodate what we're currently doing. But I will also point out that I think it was CBS News did a study and found that the average vacation term in the United States today is 4 days. So if we limit it to only weekly rentals or only 1 reservation in a 7-day period, we are acknowledging that we don't want most of the folks that vacation in the United States to come here. And I don't think that's necessarily the message we're trying to send. So come on in, folks. We've got some chairs right over here. So again, in general, we're hopeful that they will agree to allow us to do 2 reservations in a 7-day period as opposed to limiting it to just 1. And that's one of our big asks, and we don't think that's that big of an ask, but that's the one thing that we wanted to encourage, or one of the things we wanted to encourage to change. The next item on their proposal was the idea that the property owners should have $1 million of liability insurance underwritten by an insurer acceptable to the city. So I did a little bit of research today and discovered from what I could that nowhere that I can find is there a requirement from the city that anybody provide insurance for anything. This would be the first time. The only time that I can find where the city requires insurance of an individual or an entity is if you're going to use city property for private purpose, and then they want an insurance policy that lists them as additional insured. So this would be the first instance where the city is requiring somebody to have insurance. The hotels aren't required to have insurance. It's smart business, and they all do, but they're not required to. So for the most part, it's not that burdensome for somebody to take their existing policy that may offer $200,000 of liability, and to increase that to $1 million in liability, you'll find probably cost you less than $30 on the year. So it's not a burden cost-wise, but it is unusual that the city would require that. And I'm not sure what would happen if they require it and it doesn't exist and someone gets hurt, then who's responsible?
Is it unusual to require $1 million?
Well,
insurance?
I mean there's no precedence on requiring insurance at all, so much less the limit they've picked is I don't know if it's arbitrary or somebody's thought that that's good judgment. Again, I'm not opposed to the number they picked, it's just the general concept. Now, for the record, everybody who's managed by Siebert Realty, hopefully everybody in the room, you're required to have insurance, right? So just through the nature of our agreement. So, you know, again, this is aimed more at the folks that don't have property managers, that don't have a licensed real estate professional working for them. And so, you know, to some degree, it's looking out for the best interest of the renting public that may be ignorant otherwise of the condition of the home. But again, we can support it because it's not that big of a burden for cost, but it's unusual just in its general concept. Okay, so the next topic on page 23 here is the limitation on the occupancy. And this is our second big issue. This is where roughly a quarter of the properties, maybe a little bit more than that, that we currently manage would be affected by the change in the occupancy limits. If the proposed 2 people per bedroom plus 4 additional people were to go forward, we would see a dramatic adjustment in some of the things that we're doing. Our alternative suggestion would be to allow for 3 people per bedroom plus 2. Maybe a little bit arbitrary. I'm not 100% certain if anybody sat down and did some math, but I have done a little bit of math after the fact to say that only about 10 of my properties would not be, or would be affected by that limitation. And of those 10, only 2 of them by more than 2. So it pretty much would grandfather in everybody that's currently doing it at the levels they're currently doing it if we were to say 3 per bedroom plus 2. It was suggested to me today to allow for an owner to elect one or the other based on whichever one's greater. Well, based on that math, you don't get more in the 2 per bedroom plus 4 scenario until you only have 2 bedrooms. So that's kind of pointless. So again, that's our next big ask would be to adjust the occupancy limitation to 3 per bedroom plus 2 from the proposed 2 per bedroom plus 4.
So those owners that have, you know, bedrooms that have, you know, 4 bunk beds and a single and a double, that's going to affect that occupancy?
So it's not counting the individual bedrooms, it's counting the occupancy in the house.
Okay.
So if you have enough bedrooms to accommodate that plus 4 number can be in bunk rooms or on a sleep sofa or any number of other places. Yes, sir.
Correct me if I'm wrong, I may be, but doesn't that plus 3 cater to the event houses more than the average house down here?
Ironically, I guess of the homes that were affected on the 2 per bedroom plus 4, of the homes that were affected by that, I would say that all 21 of the event homes in my system are in that list, with the exception of maybe 1 that I can think of right away with it. That's not piling up onto people.
But your suggestion go to the 3 per bedroom plus. And that's my question. Doesn't that kind of characterize the event house?
Perhaps, but on the flip side of that, the 21 houses that I have that are event homes are affected perhaps, but there are 87 houses affected. So there's 60 other houses that aren't event homes that are affected by this limitation. So, Keith?
In that regard, we have a small 7-bedroom house, and this would affect 10% occupancy in that house. And we have another house with 6 bedrooms, and it would be an 11% adverse impact.
So, I mean, each property owner is going to see kind of a different impact. I would imagine most folks aren't losing a lot of sleep over the idea that maybe they would have to decrease their occupancy limitation by 2 or 3 people. That's not a big jump. I had 4 properties that are double-digit effect, and so certainly for those folks, it's a shift in the whole scheme of things.
And how are they going to enforce that? I mean, who's going to be knocking on doors?
Good question. Okay, I'm being asked to.
Yeah.
I'm being asked to repeat questions because I guess the audio here with the mic is not as good picking up you guys as perhaps me. So what we're talking about is the limitation on occupancy, and moving forward, any questions that are asked, I will repeat those for the benefit of the audience. So I guess I'm not 100% sure exactly the best tact on that. We were hoping to accommodate the majority of the people that we're representing now in a similar fashion to how we've been able to do it up till now. Obviously, we'll all change and adjust as the rules are made by a reasonable group of legislators to do that. But I think it's our duty to represent the interests of the property owners we're looking out for. If the majority of you folks think that it's a reasonable rule on the occupancy, I would strongly encourage you to say so. Definitely, and this is kind of the end of my thing, which I'm not quite there yet, but our biggest enemy in this entire thing is not somebody who suggests we should have rental restrictions. Our biggest enemy is apathy. People thinking that it won't happen because it's been happening so long down here, or that the real estate companies have so much economic might to prevent this kind of thing from happening. I got to tell you, that's not happening. We absolutely are needing to get the word out, and anybody who's inclined to say something, regardless of what your position is, I encourage you to say it so that the City Council is hopefully making their decisions based on majority input, so that they're deciding what most people want. Yes, sir.
Patrick, enforcement, the common sense of the regulation fails. That is, you could count people coming in the door, and we could be in compliance. But we see it all the time in our cottages that Aunt Susie from Chesapeake comes over and stays, or Aunt Molly and the 6 kids from Suffolk come and visit, and it's just unenforceable. Not that it's not. I'm not quarreling with the rule, but it's unenforceable.
Well, and so the question was about enforceability, and I agree completely that everybody has a relative in Hampton Roads, by the way, for some strange reason, and they all come to visit when they're on vacation. The rule is actually written that the occupancy limitation is set from 10 p.m. to 7 a.m. There is no occupancy limitation up until you hit 50, and then you apply for, or then the special event provision kicks in. Anything over 50 people on the property at one time is considered an event automatically. And then all those other rules kick in with regards to the permit and other items that are necessary. I agree completely. The idea of enforcement on that particular rule, who's counting heads, I have no idea. I would assume that that's the only kind of a provision they can enforce in the event that something else was going down, they're at the property already, and as people are bailing from here, they're counting heads saying, hey, we're dramatically exceeding the number of people that are allowed here by statute. Again, who's held accountable for that? So long as the property owner is doing what they should do, which is say, here's the limitation set by the city on occupancy, please don't exceed that. If they exceed that, that's a personal behavior that should be held, that they should be held accountable for, not the property owner. And naturally, if we see that as your agent, we want to know about that so we can look out for your interest in those issues. But, we don't want to be the one who has to enforce it, because I can't have 350 people down here to count everybody as they're going to bed at bedtime. It's unrealistic for sure. Actually, I've heard a lot about this next one, the requirement to have a contact person. So let's see here. Where's that? So that's on page 25. in general, we can support the idea that we have a contact person available 24/7 to respond to anybody from the city asking for a response. Lots of folks have taken umbrage with the 30-minute mark. I've even had a search and rescue pilot comment that that's basically the same standard they were held to, right? When life and death matters, they're held to a 30-minute response time. Property managers maybe can take a little more time than that as necessary. I'm perfectly okay with it being an hour as a reasonable response time. We actually are okay with it being 30 minutes because we try to do that for you guys already. We're trying to respond to the guests' concerns in such a short time frame. Obviously, in the middle of the night, something's going on, that's the time frame when it's probably the hardest to meet that 30-minute mark. Ironically, the 3 times I think we've had calls in the last year after 11 p.m., we've been able to respond as necessary within that time frame. So that isn't a big problem for us. It may wind up being a little bit more burdensome for folks that don't have a property manager that has an infrastructure to respond. So perhaps the city might want to consider that being an hour response time to not create a huge headache for others elsewhere, but we're okay with it. And we will also support the special event permit that has been suggested, and there's no permit required right now, but there is a limitation, 3 events per year on any property rented for the purpose. And that was an interpretation of the zoning ordinance done by the last zoning administrator, Karen Isley. I guess the rule was inherited by the current zoning administrator and hasn't been changed, but there has, even though there's been a lot of discussion over the last couple of years about event homes and the number of times it can happen and everything else that goes on around that, no rules have actually been passed. Yes, sir.
Patrick, it would seem, I guess I take exception to the no in alternative 1 and alternative 2. If I'm going to lend my house out to somebody for a party of 50, my own private house, and I'm staying there, making me I understand that's a home sharing. I'm going to stay there and I'm going to let 50 of my best friends come in and hold an event. It seems like I ought to have to get the permit too.
Well, that then starts addressing use of the property by the owner. And this isn't the main topic. So since you're the owner of the property and you're on site, you should have a greater freedom to do what you want to on your property. So long as
I was thinking more of the city's revenue from the permit.
Well, ironically, the permit cost was fairly small. I think they were trying to make it not too terribly intrusive. I think it was about $150 was what was suggested. It's basically just covering the administrative cost of it. It wasn't going to be any kind of income center for them. And it also was a streamlined permit. It didn't require going through so many hoops and hurdles that you have to do to get a special permit or a special event permit from the city. They actually have something defined as special event permit, and that's for folks that want to have a bigger party and block off roadways, and there's requirements for police and a number of other things that you have to have there for noise and traffic control and all that. We're not at that level. Yes, ma'am.
I was just thinking about what Chief was saying. So if I'm having a Christmas party, an open house, they're saying that if I have more than 50 people coming, I'm supposed to have a permit?
No. At your property, if you're there, it's your own event. It's not the purpose. The property hasn't been rented for the purpose. If it's been rented for the purpose, then the permit kicks in. But under the home sharing idea, the owner would be on site, even if it was rented for the purpose. So again, the permit wouldn't be required. I think, Mark, you had a question?
I do. Even though I'm not a renter homeowner, is there a relationship between a resident and a business building, or a business like we had down there with the shops, with fire code stating the occupancy number of people that could be in that facility based upon its structure?
Okay, so the question...
You run into that issue?
Well,
house doesn't meet that?
Kind of, but not really. So the question was, how does the issue of occupancy as it relates to residential versus commercial come into play here? There is a occupancy limitation set by the Universal Building Code, and that is the occupancy limitations that most municipalities, at least this one that I'm aware of, relies on that to set the limitation on the number of people that can sleep in a property. we aren't encouraged or wouldn't encourage the city council to view us more along the commercial side, because now we're talking retrofitting properties for sprinkler systems and third floor evacuation routes, and the cost has just gone through the roof and nobody wants to rent their house anymore. And so property values in Sandbridge disappear. So that's the catastrophic situation we want to avoid completely. So we definitely don't want this activity or the structures to be viewed in a commercial light. Okay, so I was hopeful to keep us down to an hour max, simply because the Civic League meets tonight at 7 o'clock, and I want to make sure all of you guys have an opportunity to get to the Civic League. Okay, so one person watching online has asked about the time frame. The occupancy limitation is set from 10 p.m. until 7 a.m. That's when the limitation of number of people that are allowed in the house would be enforced. I think then, presumably then from 7 a.m. to 10 p.m., the only limitation is less than 50 to avoid meeting the special events qualification. So the Business Association has met on this topic a number of times. I don't know if you guys are aware of the Sandbridge Beach Business Association, but Siebert Realty is a charter member of that. Happen to be on the board myself. And we've discussed this topic kind of continuously for the last 2.5+ years. And we have developed a position that basically mimics everything that I just got done saying. There's actually a couple of topics I think that I probably touched on that we didn't discuss much in the Business Association. But they are issuing a letter, the Business Association is issuing a letter to the Planning Commission encouraging them to vote in the fashion that we just outlined with regards to 2 rentals per week, or 2 rentals per 7-day period, and the occupancy limitations being set at 3 per bedroom plus 2. I personally am also going to be meeting with as many of these people on the Planning Commission and City Council as I personally can. And I would strongly encourage everybody, that's everybody listening and everybody here, to write the Planning Commission and the City Council with your opinion on the topic. We're going to hesitate sending you a canned letter that you can just change the names on and send in, because I have the idea that that kind of thing gets less and less impact and perhaps even aggravates the people that get them. So I would rather it be a real world experience, and you may disagree with some of the points that we have here. I'm 100% okay with that. I would want the majority of the people to be represented. So by all means, have your say. Does anybody have any other questions?
I just have a comment.
Yes, ma'am.
I personally am offended at the fact that we have to go through all this to begin with, because we have been grandfathered all along. I believe that if a non-conforming use is sanctioned and taxed by the governing authority for years, that the right to continue the same has been created. I wrote this down earlier so I wouldn't forget it. Sandbridge rentals predate the city's code. It was allowed by the Prince Anne County forever. They've always been handled like this, and it just makes no sense. Everybody knew what they purchased when they purchased here.
If you allow me to read that, I would read that for the benefit of everybody listening as well, because that's a good point, that the fact that they've allowed it to happen has effectively created the situation where it is permitted.
Added extra things into it.
That's fine. You know what, if you want to...
I can just send it to you.
You can send us to me excerpts, and we can certainly forward that on. But it's a good point, that the simple fact that the city's allowed the activity for so long and collected the tax with a big smile on their face has effectively meant that this is a permitted activity, and it should not necessarily be now being discussed to regulate it in some fashion, at least not overreaching regulations.
And also one more comment, I think that this thing is more from event homes to the short-term rentals, to this, to that, and then when several people didn't receive the acknowledgement that they thought that it should be, they continued different committees till they got the answer that they wanted. So now it's morphed into everything, short-term rentals, Airbnb, everything into one thing. And I am very offended. I understand the event homes. I understand the control of all that. That is not an issue. But all the other stuff takes away my personal property rights also. You can go to any neighborhood and have a bad neighbor, not just a short-term neighbor. Most of these people that come down here are for quiet enjoyment also. They're coming on vacation.
Couldn't agree more. And you know, naturally we want to protect those property rights and property values, and so that's why this is an issue and why we're encouraging people to have their say. Yes, ma'am.
This is just a very quick question. What is the house sign regulation?
Okay, I'm sorry, I skipped over that.
Yeah.
They are suggesting that each house that wants to do short-term rental activity is allowed to have a sign on the property not to exceed 1 foot by 1 foot. We are actually proposing an alternate that says 2 foot by 2 foot.
Well,
We're okay with
so
that.
the ones that have the great big signs right now on their property?
I don't think it's referencing a sign like, my mother has a new sign that's coming up, says 5-star, right?
Right.
That's not what they're suggesting. It's the rental sign that
It's the
says this
rental
house is for
sign.
rent.
Okay.
That sign they're
Not the
suggesting.
name of the house.
No.
That's my interpretation. I could be wrong on that, but I think it is just the solicitation sign that they're suggesting.
It's not the blue and white Siebert rental.
Well, interestingly, it is. That is the sign that they're referencing. And so we're going to suggest a change that would basically grandfather every sign that's currently in use into play. I think Siebert Realty has the largest sign. Ours is the next size down. Oh, I wasn't
And
supposed to mention
they
anybody
want the sign or they don't want the sign?
They want to limit the sign to 1 foot by 1 foot, which means we all have to go change our signs. None of our signs comply. We were suggesting that they allow for a larger sign so that everybody's sign that's currently in use would conform.
And this three strikes law, how is that gonna, how are we opposing this?
We are opposing the idea that somebody would be held responsible for somebody else's behavior.
Okay.
So,
Totally opposing.
now here's the
that.
thing, if it's a property owner, I think I can support the idea that a property owner is regularly ignoring the rules that are put before him to pay the tax or whatever else he's supposed to do. That guy maybe should lose his right to rent his house. But the idea that renters might disturb the neighborhood and the neighbor can complain about that and that be a strike against the owner, we won't support that at all. Anybody else?
We were late, I apologize.
Yes, sir, it's quite all right.
Did you already talk about your position on parking places?
Indeed, we said we can support the idea that parking would be allowed on site, that that parking must be provided for on site instead, not so much that there's any, well, in general, we support the idea there's no illegal parking. When there's on-street parking, there's on-street parking, and how they intend to enforce that car belongs to someone from Richmond versus someone from Virginia Beach, I have no idea how they plan to do that.
With the parking places on site, being related to the occupancy of the house?
There has not been a suggestion to require a particular number of spaces per group of people. That has not been suggested.
Sleeping room, bedroom?
That hasn't necessarily been suggested, and we don't think that we should be conformed to a specific number of vehicles. We think so long as there's no illegal parking going on, it should be okay.
I respectfully disagree on that.
Absolutely.
My position is that if I don't have an event house, but I have two houses down here.
Mm-hmm.
And if an event house happens to be on a front location, limited parking, that's created problems in here. With people parking in yards, with people parking in other people's driveways.
Mhm.
It seems to me the bigger houses ought to be able to somehow tie the number of spaces they have to the occupancy of the house.
Well, I think that someone would argue that it applies to every size property, not just the big ones. But I agree completely. The idea that someone's going to park in the neighbor's driveway or someplace where they should not park, illegal parking, is completely wrong. They should not do that, shouldn't be able to do that. We would want the city to enforce those rules, something they currently haven't had the driving desire to do. They don't issue many parking tickets in Sandbridge. They look for compliance as opposed to the remedial activity. We, as a property management company, encourage people to park what they can on site. If they decide to have an event, we want them to park what they can reasonably on site, and then they have to find off-site parking otherwise. And we tell them where those places can be found, and we encourage them to employ a shuttle service if necessary, or if they're close enough to one of those public places, then good for them. But we naturally would never suggest and accept someone parking just wherever. We feel like so long as it's not illegal, it should be okay.
Patrick?
Yes, ma'am.
There's a non-emergency police number that you can call and say, I cannot, you have to put it, the fact that a fire truck cannot get down the road. And they will come and ticket or take away cars that are parked illegally in that particular area.
They don't show them.
And I would always encourage people to do that. I mean, the idea that emergency vehicles can't pass is not okay. Emergency
Yeah,
vehicles
and-
always need to get past, so anytime that we have constricted parking from whatever reason it may be, whether it's a weekly rental, an event home, or day trippers, those folks should have to be complying to the rules as well.
And they will come out, and they come out fairly quickly, believe it or not.
I'm sorry, could you clarify one more time the 2 guests per bedroom? Because in our situation, we have a room that has 4.
Right, I don't
beds,
think, yep, the limitations
So that, is that considered a bedroom, that whole bedroom,
It is. The rule, I think, was written to basically to generate what the total number of people can sleep in the property. It wasn't necessarily indicated or intended to say that only 2 people can sleep in every bedroom. If you have a configuration that allows for 4 in one room and 1 in another room, it's 5, even though the mix on those 2 rooms might be 4. You can sleep 5 in there, and it counts for 5, not necessarily for, well, it counts for 4 because it's 2 bedrooms, but it's not trying to be so limited to count the number of people in any one room, but just what's the aggregate number of people that the property would accommodate. And that's why they have that plus number to allow for 2 additional people in a bunk room or a sleep sofa or something along those lines. I think they probably have, well, I don't want to open a can of worms, so I'm going to keep that one for myself. Occasionally I actually have a filter, believe it or not. Yes, ma'am.
That's the reason you want to go 3 per room.
Well, just because every property that we manage would largely would conform. And so we wouldn't have to make any significant adjustments because, the last thing I want to do is have to go with a property owner and wrestle what it's going to look like on a different rate structure because we had to drop the number of people the property can accommodate. When we have a historical model that says the house can reasonably get this much money on a weekly basis, that's kind of what drives the factor on pricing anyways. And so it's recreating the wheel just a little bit if a 5-bedroom house can't accommodate X number of people that we traditionally think it can accommodate. Mind you, that just makes my job harder. I don't know if that bothers anybody else, but yes, sir.
Can you speak to the 3 alternatives that they laid out here? I mean, they can do anything they want, right? They can mix and match these, or is there one that you think that they're leaning toward that you would?
Well, we would support alternative 3 with the modifications that we mentioned earlier, with particularly modifications to the number of rentals per week and the number of people in occupancy. The other alternatives, we're trying to separate the home sharing from the short-term rentals. We don't necessarily see a difference in the two, so they're all transient occupancy type things for us. So we think that not having that definition so refined on that piece of it leads us to alternative 3 anyways. So that's what we would support. But again, just like Mr. Eisenbach, we think.
All this stuff, right? Or do you think they're going to pick one of these? Try to pick one of these.
No, I think that I think the Planning Commission is probably going to adjust the recommendation. They're going to come up with a suggestion that the city accept these provisions and not have 3 alternatives for the city to suggest. I think the city wants it boiled down to 1 by the time City Council is looking at it.
Okay.
I could be wrong, but that to me is typically why City Council puts it out to another committee to boil it down to brass tacks. We'll have 2 opportunities for public comment, December 4th and then January 2nd, which I understand the January 2 meeting might have already been pushed to January 9th. So the vote may not happen right after New Year's. It might happen a week later. But as we find out what those dates and times are, we're definitely going to let everybody know. We're going to encourage people to communicate with the Planning Commission first, and let's see what that communication can do, what kind of rule that they're going to suggest before we take it, and hopefully we can go to City Council with a regulation that we can all support, and it will just breeze through City Council so long as it isn't full of heavy-handed regulations. Yes, sir.
Planning Commission members are easy to find on the internet.
The Planning Commission members are able to be found on this contact sheet that I have here. We are posting that online as well, but we've got all the contact pieces for Planning Commission as well as City Council on there. And so we would, again, encourage everybody to communicate. I've said this before and I'll say it again, apathy is our enemy. People who think that this just can't happen are going to be surprised. So we definitely need to get the word out. All right. And by all means, anybody who feels the need, communicate directly with me. You can call me or email me anytime. I will respond. And I appreciate everybody coming out here tonight. Sure do.
Patrick, I want to personally offer my thanks to you for organizing this. It's been very educational, very helpful, and I'm very, very appreciative of Team Siebert's efforts here.
Well, thank you, I appreciate that. So let's have the snacks before they go back. Bye, folks.